Thank you so much, Lauren. Such an insightful pre-talk. Very brave to share a story like that, so thank you. So to continue on with the night, we're going to move on to our main talk, which is the Bible study. And tonight's Bible study, we're going through Exodus chapter 11 with Andrew Derias. So Andrew, whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Alrighty, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. Thank you for the warm welcome, Mark. I'm very excited to be here and to, have a chat about this chapter. Because if we recap the story so far, so God has struck the land of Egypt with 9 plagues, but Pharaoh is still not letting, the Jews go back home to go back to Israel, and he's still hardening his heart. The people of Egypt all around him are suffering, but he's just blind to that, while clearly there's something else going on, and like the people of Israel are otherwise safe and not affected by these things. It's a fairly short chapter, being 10 verses. So if you guys don't mind, we'll just read through the entire chapter, and then I think there's quite, even with 10 verses, there's quite a bit to unpack there. And we'll just go through it bit by bit. So can I just get maybe 2 verses each and pass the microphone around to read?
And the Lord said to Moses, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. Afterward, he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will surely drive you out of here altogether. Speak now in the hearing of the people, and let every man ask from his neighbor and every woman from her neighbor articles of silver and articles of gold.
And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of the people. Then Moses said, Thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt.
And all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of the Pharaoh who sits on the throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the animals. Then there shall be a great cry throughout the land of Egypt, such as was not like it was before, nor shall it be like it again.
But against none of the children of Israel shall a dog move its tongue, against man or beast, that you may know that the Lord does make a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. And all these your servants shall come down to me and bow down to me, saying, Get out, and all the people who follow you. After that I will go out. Then he went out from Pharaoh in great anger.
But the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will not heed you, so that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. So Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the children of Israel go out of his land.
All right, thank you. So from reading this chapter, I tried to unpack a few things that I found particularly striking to me. The first being that, there's very clearly a distinction between the people of Israel and the people of Egypt, and it's a symbolic distinction. It's one that kind of still exists today. It's like the distinction between God's people who follow Him and people that are outside. And we can see from the first 3 verses in that the Lord gave the people favor in front of the side of the Egyptians. So even though Pharaoh, the big boss, was angry and, really trying to flex his muscles and show that he's powerful, the people of Egypt knew that something was different about the Israelites. And the people that he had put in charge, like Moses, had a position of special consideration in society. Moses is described as being great in the land of Egypt in the sight of Pharaoh's servants and the people. Clearly something is different. And this isn't an isolated thing. Off the top of my head, I was able to think of St. Paul and the prison guard, St. Peter and the centurion's servant, God always brought honor to the people that he, sent out to preach about him by his power. And those are the examples I can think of off of my head, but are you guys able to think of others? Other examples where, God had people, sent them out, and he gave them honor in front of people that were either their enemies or not known to them. Well, I think one other example is with Jesus himself, when the centurion said to him, Lord, I'm not worthy for you to come into my roof, just say the word, and my servant will be healed. So we get this example that humility and doing the work of God is a way to become honorable in and of itself. And it's really through God that we get this honor, and it's honor that's not, the source isn't pride, and it's not anything that we did, but it's God's work that is magnifying him, and in turn his people, we are his body, we become magnified when his name is also magnified. Questions or comments so far? Okay. Now, we all know what's going to happen in the next chapter. This chapter is a preamble to the 10th plague, which is killing the firstborn of all the living things in Egypt, besides the Israelites. And there's a heavy amount of symbolism that is starting to become clear in this chapter. There's also more symbolism associated with the Passover and the practices there. But, that we can start unpacking some of that symbolism here, and I'm personally not great at symbolism, so I sort of left that to the church fathers to talk about. I just had a few questions, really. So why at midnight? Why not in the day? Is God not able to kill anyone in the day? Is that something he's restricted by, really? Hands up for yes? Hands up for no? 2 hands, okay. Yeah, so God is all powerful, right? He can do anything he wants at any time. But Saint Hippolytus of Rome comments that specifically at midnight is when the strike took place in the darkness of night, as in the veil of darkness, away from the bright light of day. Justice is realized in the devil and his dark crimes. That's a bit wordy, but what does that mean? It basically means God is in the den of the devil, where the devil is the most powerful. God is showing his ability and his power to come and to execute justice for his people. He is when the devil is supposed to be the most powerful away from the light, God is still almighty. And I find that really comforting to know that even in my darkest moments, even when I feel like everything is against me, or I'm surrounded by, I'm being pressured by people around me to do something wrong, God is there with me, and he has the power. All we need to do is ask. He has the power to execute his justice and to save us, to plunge us out of the devil's snare. I also asked, why the firstborn? The firstborn has a lot of symbolism associated with it, not just in Hebrew culture, because the firstborn was slated to, gain the inheritance and everything. But in a lot of ancient cultures, you'll find that there is symbolism associated with the firstborn. They are they are destined to inherit their father's business, and they're destined to be great. They're destined to be the best, if that makes any sense. But why, but why specifically the firstborn being, killed, or as a punishment for the land of Egypt? Well, it's sort of God again showing that no one is too high and no one is too low. Verbatim from the passage, it says that from the firstborn of Pharaoh, the one at the top, to the firstborn of the female servant behind the handmill and of the animals, is not so low as to be forgotten. God knows everyone, and God is able to reach everyone. There is no one too high out of his reach or too low below his notice. And Father Tadros Malati, he comments that God allowed all the firstborns to be killed with no exception as a symbol of how he devastates evil. So God has no tolerance for the evil of the people, for the evil of Pharaoh, and that's why, without exception, from the son of Pharaoh to the animals, the firstborns were killed. Contrast this with the way he treats his children. Like, what do we think? For all the firstborns of the lands of Egypt dying versus not even, sorry. Let me just get this verbatim. Not a dog shall move its tongue against man or beast. I mean, isn't that amazing? Like, how much protection we're offered by God. The fact that all of nature is under his command, and he is able to save us from not just the spiritual struggles, but the physical struggles. And that's the treatment we can have if we follow him and we do his word. The scholar Tertullian also comments that, if you remember back earlier on in Exodus, Pharaoh ordered all the children of the Israelites to be killed because he ordered them to be thrown into the river. So by doing this, God is actually getting vengeance for his people. And the Tertullian, he comments that the Egyptians have paid the price of what they have done to the Hebrew children by throwing them in the river. St. Gregory of Nyssa further comments on this, and he says that this is a reference to the devastation of every cause of sin, to destroy it since its onset. Because if you kill the firstborn, if you think about it, killing the firstborn of evil is like killing the sin that leads to another. For example, lust and anger lead to adultery and murder. It's sort of like cutting the head of the snake off before it can, grow and attack you. So really, the symbolism of the firstborn, in a nutshell, is that God is doing it so that he shows that he devastates sin without exception and before it grows to a point where it becomes problematic, versus how he treats his children who have, his protection, who he guides and he protects from the physical and the spiritual struggles. Does that make sense? You guys are looking at me with blank faces. Questions or comments? Okay. Now, Pharaoh, I don't know, he's a weird personality, right? In the previous chapter, he said, you can go, just leave your livestock here. But even after Moses announced that the firstborns would be killed, Pharaoh hardens his heart again. I find it kind of weird, because this is the most devastating plague yet, I would say. Not darkness, not locusts, not failed harvests. God is actually going out and immediately killing the people of Egypt. And yet this is the most obstinate response we've received from Pharaoh. He just immediately is like, no. He doesn't make any concessions. He doesn't make any, you can leave with but leave, half of your livestock or half of this or some of that. Just no. And I just want to explore that character because it's interesting how he doubles down even harder when the stakes are raised. He's not taking defeat easily. He's not, being intelligent or being rational, I would say. And I think it merits exploring a bit of the context of Egypt and how society was run, because if we think about it, and again, this isn't my interpretation, this is something I heard, that Pharaoh was considered a god to the people of Egypt. So for this guy, Moses, who is a nobody that were conquered by the land of Egypt, or not conquered, but enslaved by the people of Egypt, to come up and say there's a God greater than you, it's a matter of pride and it's a matter of principle that Pharaoh has to oppose him. It's like if Pharaoh admits defeat, it's like he's saying there is a God greater than me, there is a God that is above me. And if he does that, you can imagine how his ability to rule the people would slip. I mean, he'd have to be blind not to notice that his a power to rule was already slipping, because the people of Egypt liked the people of Israel, and Moses was quite popular. But again, I think pride kind of blinded him there. But I also want to talk about the sentence that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. If we can go to Proverbs chapter 29, verse 1. So it says, "He who is often rebuked and hardens his neck will suddenly be destroyed, and that without remedy." Does that sound like Pharaoh? Does that sound like us sometimes? Like bouncing off Lauren's talk, sometimes we think we've got the way, like a man plans his way, right? We think we've got it right and we're gonna go all the way in one path. But it's not necessarily that God is going to destroy Pharaoh, it's just the consequences of his actions. And same for us, when we harden our hearts, when we become stiff-necked and not listen to God's attempts to guide us in the right path, the consequences of our actions is destruction, because there is no other alternative. God's path is life, everything else is death. And if we can, again, sorry Daniel, I know I'm annoying, Ezekiel chapter 33, verse 11. So in Ezekiel chapter 33, verse 11, God says, "I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn from this way and live." And I think that again reinforces that point that God tries to guide us in the right way, but if we're going to exercise our free will and just point in the direction away from Him, we're headed away from life, and it's a path of destruction. And I think it's also an assurance that God doesn't force anyone to sin. It's sort of just sometimes pride and our desires and our ambitions blind us to the way that God is leading us. And from this, I think we can take a few practical points. And I'll pass this question to you guys now. How can we not be like Pharaoh? How do we, turn our hearts to God? How do we, ease them and make them, willing to turn to Him? Any ideas? Yeah. Yeah, and think about how many times humility, or somebody showing humility has led to them, being lifted up, being exalted. Like when the apostles showed humility and showed mercy to the people that came to them, even to the people that were their enemies, God still exalted them. He broke them out of prisons. He heals the sick. He showed that He is powerful in our weakness. Anything else? Yes. How do we do that? Please, it's a discussion. How do we deny our desires, guys? I might weigh in on this one, but I'd like to get some of your opinions. So I think denying our desires, it's a stepwise process. We can't immediately be born and just say, "Oh yes, I'm going to say no to cigarettes. I'm going to say no to adultery. I'm going to say no to the sin of the flesh and that kind of thing." it's like working your like training your body, your discipline, and your ability to have willpower is a muscle. So it needs training, and the church has put systems in place for us to deny our desires already. Like I think the Orthodox Church, we spend more than half the year fasting, and that in and of itself is training to deny our desires. It's not just, so yes, the food is a part of it, but when we bridle the flesh, we can also, bridle the mind. Because there's a mind-body connection, if anybody believes in that. Well, what else? I'd like some ideas, guys. Abuna?
To not be afraid of humiliation or being ashamed. And maybe in this case, Pharaoh was too scared to be ashamed or humiliated in front of Moses, so his heart got harder and harder. Because if we're not so scared to be ashamed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And can I just comment, I think Moses has been an absolute class act in this entire book. So Pharaoh told him, I don't want to see your face again. And Moses said to him, sure, you're not going to see my face again. And sure enough, Moses didn't talk to Pharaoh again. He was just, standing standing in front of the people and just telling whoever would hear, because Pharaoh wasn't going to listen anymore. So he had a bit of humility and said, okay, without fear of humiliation, he just went out and told the people so they'll be ready. But when Pharaoh asked, Moses did as he was asked. Yeah, I thought I'd just comment on that bit. Any questions or comments now? Okay, let's talk about something that stumped me a bit. In verse 2, so God tells Pharaoh to tell every man ask from his neighbor and every woman from her neighbor articles of silver and articles of gold. That was weird for me to read. I'm not actually quite sure what's going on here. And it stumped me. I tried to do some research, but I couldn't really find an answer. So I'll pass that question again to you guys. What do you guys think? Is there some tradition or just symbolism associated with that? Any ideas, Amuna?
The only thought I had is that they're now going to leave. God is sure that they're going to leave, so perhaps they're going to plunder the Egyptians. They're going to leave with the wealth of the Egyptians and as much as they can take. It's the only thought I have.
That makes sense. Okay, yeah, makes sense. That's funny. Alrighty. Anything else come up? Do you guys ideas about how we can not be like Pharaoh? Okay, so in a nutshell, fairly short chapter, but I think there's quite a bit that we've unpacked. And the takeaways really are that when God's work is done, when we humble ourselves and make Him the center of our lives and bring Him to other people, it brings honor back to us. And by glorifying God, the body of God is glorified. So it's not just the person that's doing the work, but it's the entire community. In the same way that because Moses was great in the sight of the people, the Israelites were also well respected by the Egyptian people because clearly there was something different about them. Also, we sort of get the beginning of the symbolism that is associated with the 10th plague in terms of the killing of the firstborns, that God is going to devastate evil where it's strongest, and is going to do it without distinction and without letting it grow and evolve to be something that is more dangerous. And finally, when we harden our hearts to God, like Pharaoh does, we open up to sin and vice versa. And based on your suggestions, the best way is really that we, make our hearts soft and able for God to do His work, is by having humility, not being afraid of humiliation, and denying ourselves the lusts of the flesh, Anything else to add? Any comments or questions? Yes.
I have a question. What would you say would be a good test for us to see if we're hardening our hearts towards God? Like, what can we do to look at ourselves and say, maybe I am hardening my heart towards Him?
I think one of the things that I've noticed when I feel like I'm hardening my heart to God is that things don't go right anymore. Like, if my routine breaks down, like if I'm not attending mass, if I'm not doing service, and I'm deciding, okay, I'm going to focus on this other thing. When God no longer becomes my main focus, things start to fail. I feel a bit aimless sometimes. I just kind of waste a lot more time. So I often find myself in this spiral where when I harden my heart to God, things get progressively worse and worse. And it's only really when I turn to Him that I feel like things can get better again. It could be a mental thing, but I think that's one of the litmus tests, really, if we've hardened our heart to God, that we're no longer on the path to life. We mentally, physically start to become tired and drained because we're not near the source of life and happiness. But again, this is a discussion, so what do you guys think? Have I answered your question at all? Anything else to add? Abuna?
God gives. So when your heart is soft towards God and His work actually happens, so in this case, the people will be released from Egypt, and Pharaoh lets them go, the product is actually joy. They're joyful, they're happy, they're calm, they're peaceful. When the plan of God doesn't happen, even if it brings great wealth and material possessions, it doesn't come with the gifts that God gives, which is peace and joy and happiness and all these things. So you can test in your own heart the gifts. If the gifts of God are there, that I'm peaceful, that I'm happy, I'm patient, loving, caring, forgiving, and this is more and more in my heart, then I'm generally walking in God's pathway. If I find that I am unhappy, sad, anxious, angry, unforgiving, agitated, then you can, it's like a sign, it's a test. All these things are tests. So the gifts of the Spirit are a test, a sign that things are going in the right direction. I'm walking God's path. The opposite is true, that the characteristics of the devil, envy, jealousy, anger, negative thoughts, all these things, then perhaps I am doing something a bit wrong and I need to go back and reassess and try to soften my heart or reevaluate myself in some way to correct and therefore get the gift. So maybe you can test yourself against those things.
Thank you. Well, if there's nothing else to add, that's really all I have. So thank you all, and glory be to God forever. Amen.
All right. Thank you so much, Andrew. Such a beautiful talk on Exodus chapter 11. Very well spoken, so thank you.